Good morning to everybody. Well, at least good morning in California. I should say good afternoon, I think, to all of our panelists today, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you in Europe among our attendees. I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. On behalf of myself and Bernhard Kappa, CEO of Orthogonal, and Buddy Smith, who's the Director of Technical Consulting at our partner MedSec, we're really happy to see so many of you here. There's a great attendee list of people. Thanks for taking time out of a very busy schedule to come with us and join this conversation and learn. And we also want to welcome our guests today, Kyle Matthews, who leads firmware development at Blur, which is a medical device product development firm that Orthogonal collaborates with Blur every chance we get. And Jim Hewitt, who's an engineering lead at Orthogonal and has an inordinate amount of knowledge around Bluetooth. Kyle and Jim are here because they actually both recently worked together on a medical device where Orthogonal was leading the smartphone app side of the medical device, and Blur was leading the physical medical device side. And as we'll get into, it was a very successful collaboration, unusually so for this area, and so we thought we'd share some of the best practices. We're going to try and pack a good 4 hours of content into the next hour or so. Today, we're talking about bridging the gap between medical device software and hardware with Bluetooth connectivity. And software is probably a little misleading because what we're really talking about is the software on a consumer smartphone side generally, and then software on a fixed physical proprietary medical device. We do these webinars, I think most of you know, once a month, and we try to bring in a lot of different experts and share best practices. I've said this line several times, but it's actually true this time. This is the second to last webinar in our series on Bluetooth. We kept adding more as we thought of things, but I swear this is it. And we've covered a whole range of topics related to how do you leverage Bluetooth as a tool for medical device connectivity. Been a great series. Curly can share, please, in the chat, the link to the whole series. You can see all the webinars. Past recordings are all posted on YouTube. We have summaries of all the sessions there, and there's also some interesting blogs we've done, like looking at recent Bluetooth devices that have been approved by the FDA, and a trip down memory lane looking at some of the very first devices with Bluetooth approved by the FDA. Final webinar, November 8th, I have down, I think that's right. A great guest, Ketil Halstead, who's the EVP for Strategy and Product Management at Nordic Semiconductor, which is sort of arguably at the very top of the food chain for wireless chips. And he's going to come talk not about what we do today, but about where wireless is going in general. So if you're just thinking about products 5 to 10 years out, medical devices, well, what's going to be different? What's going to be incremental and what could be revolutionary? And how do you start planning for some of that now? It'll be a good conclusion. We will be posting the session online, yada, yada. Okay, so basically, we're going to, as we promised, we'll get you in and out of here in 50 minutes, or 55 maybe. But within the hour, you'll get all the content we've promised you around this subject and some Q&A. However, as is our tradition, we will stay on up to a full 90 minutes because we generally find the questions go on and on and on. And amazingly, it's been pretty consistent, these webinars. We have about 40% of the people still there at minute 90. So we're happy to keep talking, but we promise we will get you through the core in that time. And we do reserve the right to defer some questions that are a little just too specific to your needs and stuff. And we're happy to take those offline if you want. So with those introductions done, Bernhard, if you could kick it off, could you talk for a minute about why this topic even merits a webinar? And then why was it that once we picked this topic, we had to have Jim and Kyle on here to have this conversation?
Yeah, so before we do that, I want to highlight something. This is the first time in one of these webinars you've used the word yada yada. And so I think you should make this a practice and at least use it at least once going forward in those things.
It was a shout out to all the Seinfeld fans in the room.
There you go. So, we've worked on a lot of Bluetooth connected device projects over the years for medical device companies, pacemakers, insulin pumps, CGMs, spinal cord nerve stimulators, and everything in between. And we do the mobile app side, cloud, AI algorithms, and then a device team typically handles the hardware, the firmware on the device, and ideally we collaborate on the interfaces, the Bluetooth profiles, the testing, the risk management, etc. Sometimes those are internal teams, and sometimes those are product development companies like Blur. And what we've seen is that there's really a vast difference of outcomes on projects, how long they take, how expensive they are, how performant and reliable they are. And Jim and I were talking through this in relation to a current client of ours, where it was like, what are the things that sort of we can help guide them on in terms of sort of best practices, bad practices? What are the things that work towards success in those teams working together and ultimately getting a system solution together? And we worked through these things and came up with a number of things. One of them is have really, really experienced people who know what they're doing, have done complex Bluetooth things on both sides of this, right? And we looked, we've had great success in particular with Blur on collaborating on a number of projects. And when we were thinking of great people on both sides, it immediately came to Kyle and our interaction with him. So that was kind of the genesis of this. There's a whole bunch of kind of best practices that between the two teams we've talked about, we've implemented, we've learned along the way. And so I thought that would be a great thing to share. It's really that when I say there's good outcomes, bad outcomes, we've seen this before where kind of the wrong things are done or the wrong teams are involved. It can double the length, double or more the cost of the entire project, and that's not the end, right? You end up with something that is hamstrung, not performing well, not reliable, and then you have to spend more money undoing the bad things you did afterwards, so you can continue to pay for it for a long time. So it's really important to get this right. That's why we decided to do this particular webinar.
And I'll add to that from a client's point of view. It's not just that they're overrun and over budget. They're also not out there selling that device and making money, which should dwarf the cost of the original development. It's the lost revenue in there. So bottom line, Bernhard, Bluetooth for medical devices is not for dummies, and nobody should ever write that book.
Well, I'll read the book if it comes out.
All right.
There's going to be a lot of yada yada in there.
Why don't we start with Jim and then go to Kyle, and let me ask you questions. Tell us a bit about yourself and then about the project you worked on together. And for the audiences, I'm sure many of you will understand we're not going to be able to name the client. We're going to have to be a little vague on certain topics, but we should be able to get to a good level of detail. And then I'd like you to address the question, why is it that medical device software app people are from Mars and medical device hardware people are from Venus? To quote the famous marriage book. Jim, you want to go first?
I have been working with Orthogonal for quite some time now. I started out in the industry quite a long time ago, as is obvious. Did a lot of hardware development and a lot of firmware development before I joined the Orthogonal team. But since joining Orthogonal, have been involved primarily in mobile device software development, interfacing with Bluetooth, and I have done some firmware development on the Bluetooth device side of things as well. I probably would characterize the question a little bit differently. Why software people are from Venus and hardware development people are from Mars. Probably because of my perspective, having been on both sides of the equation, I do understand the scenario, do understand the problems involved. It is important that people communicate with each other throughout the process and have a good understanding of what is being developed and have upfront documentation and architectural concepts that will provide a decent outcome of the overall process itself. Being of the hardware background more so than the software background, I consider myself more of a Martian than of a Venetian, I guess. But I do understand both sides of the equation.
You're muted, Randy.
Thank you. Kyle, who are you and why is this so painful?
Sure. Yeah. First, thank you for the very kind words. But yeah, I'm Kyle. I'm the director of firmware engineering at Blur. I've worked with Jim and Orthogonal for a number of years, and it's been a great opportunity. Very thankful for having the ability to work with some fantastic teams throughout my career so far. But yeah, to answer your question, it's a multifaceted answer here, but I'm going to go with a couple of them very quickly. Number one is typically when you don't have somebody like Jim who has experience on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, you have vastly different domain expertise and different optimization goals. You're both kind of pulling in different directions, and two of the big things that I want to hit on. The first is a tendency to sort of drive simplification on your own side and push complication to the other side. So that's kind of like saying to yourself, oh, this is XYZ complicated edge case. We can handle that. In my case, I'd say, oh, we can handle that in the app and push it over to you. And that's what you absolutely cannot do. And two other quick answers. Oftentimes the teams are brought together way too late. Getting brought together as soon as possible has always been beneficial from our aspect. And finally, and sort of as part of the previous answer, oftentimes the device hardware side will come up with an initial draft of that BLE spec or contract and then try to stick with it. And that's not ideal, right? Because the app development team, the software team, is going to have their own needs, so to speak, that they're going to need to hit on. And if you have this set in stone contract that just the device hardware side had come up with, that's not going to do the app development team any favors. So,
Jim, could you maybe clarify for a second something Kyle mentioned? What is a Bluetooth spec? How does it look different than an API spec or a systems requirement document or anything? What's in there, just for people who aren't familiar?
The Bluetooth spec itself is typically called a profile or a primary profile that has secondary services associated with it as well. Bluetooth SIG has defined quite a few standardized profiles for covering scenarios like glucometers, health-related devices for measuring heart rate or for controlling exercise, such as bicycle sensor information. But it's basically the contract whereby the Bluetooth device communicates with the central device, in our case, typically a mobile application. It could be a PC as well. And just like standardized software, where we have a contract for talking with a backend API cloud infrastructure or talking with another application, it defines how the communication takes place between two devices.
So it's got two components. One is it's essentially the data interface and the definition of the data interface and what the data points are and the ranges and those kinds of things. And the other one is, if you thought of Bluetooth as like a ham radio, it's all the dials and switches and levers you get so that two people can find each other on the radio.
Correct.
All right, great.
I had a question, sorry, to following up on Kyle's point, which is that, both sides of it are dealing with different constraints, right? And optimizing for those different constraints. Maybe, Kyle, if you could talk about that on the kind of firmware hardware side, and Jim on the mobile app side, I think that would be, illuminating for some of our audience.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the biggest one that stands out is sort of the push and pull of power optimization, battery optimization, and how that plays into sort of the user experience the device responsiveness, things like that. And there's certain things that you can do on the hardware side with Bluetooth to kind of ease that while still allowing you to hit those power consumption figures that you'd like, but provide, a quick responding device, a quick pairing device, and one that can be updated and downloaded from quickly. So that's the biggest one that stands out is sort of the hardware constraints that need to be optimized for. Battery life is the big one. And then there's also going to be sort of the physicality of the device, right? Working in how Bluetooth plays together with any buttons on the device and things like that, or lack thereof, right? A lot of devices these days don't have any buttons at all. So it's when you do need, and a lot of times this plays into working with solving some of the edge cases, right? With the device gets stuck or something like that. You need to be a little bit clever sometimes in how you design sort of a fallback, and oftentimes that goes with the physical buttons. But yeah, the big ones for me are sort of the user experience and the battery optimization.
Could you all maybe touch on sort of what are the
Sorry,
other
could we get Jim's answer on the other side?
Yeah, I think from the central device perspective or the user interface perspective, it's important that that interface provides functionality that is easy to provide a user experience from, which does oftentimes go against what is optimal from the device point of view. I will say also that oftentimes the device is the first of any of these items that receives funding and receives development for any of these types of scenarios, and therefore oftentimes the user experience and the requirements on the central device, or in our case, the mobile device, is often a secondary concern.
Makes sense. Yeah, I would add, right, sort of, that we've talked about this in previous webinars, right, on the smartphone side. We're dealing with different types of hardware, different operating systems, change among those things, and the fact that you don't have full control over the device, and that the smartphone is also optimized not necessarily as a medical device connectivity device, but as a consumer device. So battery consumption is managed by the operating system. The user experience is managed, and you have an app that is part of that. So things like background Bluetooth processing is, again, limited control, and things that can happen when you have low battery on the smartphone. So there's a whole bunch of constraints. I would say in some ways more constraints on the smartphone and edge case things on the smartphone side than on the device side. But Kyle may disagree with that.
Kyle
no, I
mentioned earlier about power consumption, and I wanted to kind of mention one of those trade-offs that's really difficult sometimes, especially from the security perspective, is we're concerned about privacy. So if you have let's say an implanted medical device that's always beaconing, then someone might be able to use that signal to track. But that uses less energy than having the receiver run listening for the mobile device to beacon. So it's a really interesting area where you have to do a lot of trade-offs, because from a security perspective, we would prefer that the mobile device does the beaconing and the implanted device does the listening. But I know maybe Kyle, from your perspective, your energy budget may dictate a different choice.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Good point.
It really does sound like a marriage where there has to be sort of compromises on all sides, and there's not one perfect answer, right? It's getting to the right middle ground. Or as you'd say, no, it's not that one side is right and one side is wrong necessarily. I mean, I suppose one side could just have an awful idea, but
And as a security engineer, that's when we punt to our risk analysts and let them make the ultimate decision, taking in all the factors and the residual risk of the device.
Kyle, does that qualify as pushing the hard work to another team?
No, I don't think so. You gotta, there's always a little bit of give and take, like I said, and he makes a great point there, is maybe so kicking it over to risk might be a little bit of a punt, but you know, we do the same thing in the firmware land too, so we'll allow it.
I want to jump back to a point that kind of a point that Bernhard touched on, which was, you know, saying that smartphones were designed as consumer first applications, not exclusively for the use of supporting a medical device. That's in many ways true for Bluetooth itself. I mean, the original use case for Bluetooth that everybody talked about was that you could stream music from your MP3 player, like your iPod Touch, to your car speakers, right? That was a really exciting use case that you wouldn't have to physically plug it into the audio jack to connect the two. So if Bluetooth, which is designed 2 decades ago, more, with kind of consumer use cases, what are the implications of that for systems that may have higher performance standards and higher reliability standards, safety critical systems, including devices?
I would say that over the past 2 decades, that the original Bluetooth has been expanded upon significantly. The original Bluetooth did not include any BLE functionality whatsoever. And over the course of the last few years, a lot of additional attention has been devoted to providing security, providing a level of operation that does save on power and significantly has improved the specification to address those specific concerns.
So if somebody last touched Bluetooth with a medical device several years ago, they should know if they're coming back to today with newer versions of Bluetooth, it's not the same Bluetooth for a medical device manufacturer.
Correct. It's an improved Bluetooth from the standpoint of security, from the standpoint of throughput. Yes.
Let's talk about the human element of collaboration, because I don't know why, but it seems like from a client perspective, you know, medical device manufacturers, it's almost like, you know, to paraphrase from Wayne's World, it's like, we fear Bluetooth. Bluetooth makes my life hell, you know, and for some reason, it almost seems in bad scenarios sometimes to draw out the worst in anti-collaborative behaviors among teams and finger pointing. Why is that? And what did you guys do that was so great that removed that from the scenario?
Yeah, I'll hit that one first. First, that's a great question. So a lot of times you see this butting heads right at the device app interface, and that's kind of what we've been hammering on throughout the webinar so far. But there's this vicious cycle that exists when you don't have a good collaborative environment where, you know, you're continually butting heads at this interface, either because you started too late, it was already set in stone, you're not confident in your firmware, things like that. And you begin to sort of dread the integration meetings because it's just a whole bunch of finger pointing and you don't really want to make changes to accommodate the other side. And it all sort of spirals down into a breakdown of communication and an inability to put yourself in the other side's shoes that makes it difficult to implement anything at all, right? And so, you know, in that regard, you asked about best practices and sort of keys to success a little bit. The first thing for me is going to be reducing the friction and increasing your modes of communication as much as possible. So the very first thing we did was, you know, we had a Confluence page and a Slack channel that we were both very heavily involved in addition to, you know, weekly meetings. So we wanted to reduce that feedback to be nearly instant. If Jim had a question, he could message me and we would have a response immediately. And we had a great deal of communication, Jim, especially in the beginning when we were coming up with this spec, you know, a daily back and forth to come up with it. And also kind of a desire to put each other, you know, put ourselves in the other shoes to make it easy for the other person. So that was sort of a guiding principle on the hardware side, was to to make the orthogonal side their life as easy as possible. And there's a couple other points too that we can hit on, but Jim, if you have any insight too, feel free to jump in.
No, I would agree with everything you said there, and likewise, on the software side, we wanted to make sure that you didn't have to jump through hoops as well to provide the information that we needed to display. I think the key factor is collaboration. The hardware team and the software team need to collaborate on the development and the design. You need to do the upfront design work before things are formalized in firmware or in software, so that both parties understand what it is that they're dealing with and how they are going to communicate. And if you do that homework and do it well, the design and the development flow much more easily.
Does that mean you nail it out of the gate and it's fixed for the rest of the project?
No.
Yeah.
You try, but you don't always, you frequently do not nail it out of the gate.
So a question for everybody on this panel. How do you successfully deal with evolution and change? How do you identify the need for change? How do you coordinate it? When does it become painful because it's too late in coming? Too much work has been done. I'd love to hear from all four panelists on this one.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I would say, it's just a mindset sort of keeping fluidity at the top of your mind. So again, keeping your lines of communication short, your ability to sort of iterate on things quickly, and having a big thing for us was a living document that we could reference that was up to date. So, how that actually looks is, perhaps a little bit of a lag in signing off on, like a PSP or something like that, to allow that living document kind of time to flourish. And you'll find too that the fluidity, it sort of tapers off over time, right? So it'll start with a document that changes rapidly and changes a lot. But as you kind of go through and you're starting to hit edge cases, it tapers off, and you might only need to make smaller changes. And that when to sort of start locking things down kind of comes with experience, I think.
Iteration is the key.
Iteration. So can you talk
Early
about
and often.
shift left, Bernhard, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, look, early and often, I think to me, kind of, anytime you have a complex system with lots of subsystems and different groups working on that, that coordination between the groups is super important. So early on at the definition stage, thinking through how you're going to collaborate and integrate these things, and then how are you going to test? Oh, I made this change. How are you going to go through that? What kind of automation are you investing in on both sides? Those are all things that can make it go a lot smoother. I would say one thing though, just back to the collaboration here, it helps tremendously when you have people like Jim and Kyle who really do know what they're doing and have deep experience. That's not always going to be the case with teams, and we find that sometimes, let's say we're dealing with an internal team, and they're great firmware engineers, but they're really doing their first Bluetooth project or the first thing of this complexity, and very often they don't necessarily have the mental model of, oh, this is the central, this is the peripheral, these are really the constraints that we have. And so there's an education that has to happen. And that, we learn things from Kyle learns things from us. We're open to those types of things. I think that's the other thing, sort of being open to collaborating and learning from the other side is super important. That has we've seen that sometimes where there is let's say an external team, they're not necessarily that experienced. They've sold themselves as being experienced, it can be very difficult to then collaborate with those folks. And we've had some interesting experiences in that regard.
So let me manifest a classic worst practice here with my next question. Oh yeah, buddy, what about cybersecurity? Does that fit into this? I don't want to forget that.
Definitely wait until you're completely finished with your architecture, your firmware, and your application before you think about security. And of course, I am being sarcastic because it's really important to think about security when you even sit down to talk about what you're going to make. Security should be part of your architecture. Your threat model should be part of your. You should have cybersecurity requirements that are built in up front so that you don't end up with, we're doing our 510K filing next week, so let's get a penetration test. And oh boy, we've got a bunch of stuff that came back that we can't change at this late in the game. You don't want to be rushing to fix anything in your penetration test report right up until your regulatory deadlines. We always recommend, test early, test often. You might have a device and you don't have a mobile app that's ready for it yet, but if you have a test harness that your developers are using, go ahead and do a penetration test of the device and give that test harness to the penetration testing team so they can exercise the device. And then when the app is ready, you're going to repeat it, but now you're going to be testing the device and the application. And you can iterate on security just like you're iterating on all of the rest of the form and function of your system. It's really important to have security have a seat at the table from beginning to end.
So if security has a seat at the table, does that mean that security is spending lots and lots of hours sitting at the table waiting for something to come up that will impact security to go, oh yeah? Like, how do you efficiently do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to, especially, there's a difference of a large MDM that's made hundreds of devices, and they hopefully have a mature cybersecurity and product security program that they can leverage. But if you're a smaller, maybe you're a startup, this is your first medical device, it's really important to have a partner or a stakeholder who can help you avoid some of the common pitfalls. So, we definitely recommend a threat model up front, and even as you're iterating on your design, your threat model should be a living document that changes as the device progresses. And even as you make updates and changes to the system, you want to go back and update your threat model, just like you would update your risks documentation. And, it's all a living, breathing thing.
I would say, I would add to that, right? So in general, right, we subscribe to doing agile development in general, more agile, fast feedback loop practices. So the same way we do patient risk management is not a big upfront, oh, we're all done. It is a question of sort of, as you evolve the product, as you come up with new features, look at the risk analysis, mitigations as features or user stories, testing those things throughout the process as part of your agile cadence. The same idea can be very much applied to cybersecurity risk management. It is a similar backlog process that interfaces with your design, your testing, your mitigations, et cetera.
So since we're on cybersecurity, buddy, is it just your Bluetooth encryption, and what are kind of the major factors to consider that are Bluetooth related cybersecurity stuff?
So you want to use the latest and greatest version that you can. If you tell the FDA that you're using Bluetooth 2.0 with no security, you're going to have some difficulties with that. You may say, we looked in the field and our customers' devices only have Bluetooth 5.0, so we have to support that, but we also support 5.1 or 5.2 or the next latest and greatest. You have to have that story of trade-offs between usability and security. And in terms of that, you can also add additional layers on top of that. One thing that we really recommend is application layer encryption. So the Bluetooth link between your device and a mobile application or anything else that your device is talking to over Bluetooth it's fully encrypted with a separate set of keys, such that an attacker can't just pair with a device and talk to it and control it. There are extra steps, and you can even go as far as to having a separate set of keys for things that are involved in maintenance or firmware upgrades, and a separate set of keys for a clinician or a user. And you can really make this granular.
Layers of encryption. Interesting question came in. I'd like to encourage the audience, please turn in more questions, but this is a great one for Timely. How do you tackle the differences in the pace of development between firmware software and smartphone software when developing a device? Hardware is usually longer time intervals, whereas software sprints are in increments of 2 to 4 weeks. And I don't think that's just a Bluetooth question, but it does involve Bluetooth in the connection.
Typically in mobile app development, there are a lot of stories that don't deal directly with Bluetooth itself. Stories around user configuration information, other functionality that the application provides. So we typically identify all of those tickets, and then we can schedule the Bluetooth related activities to occur when the hardware is available to do that. We have also in the past put together Bluetooth emulation applications that will run on our smartphone or on a PC or Mac device to allow us to do development of the app while the hardware is under development and before it becomes available. So there are several ways of dealing with that scenario.
I think that's a great segue, thanks, Jim, into emulators and simulators.
I would ask on Kyle on that front, what are the timelines and cycles there for that? I certainly think you can do agile development and faster development cycles on firmware, maybe not hardware, but certainly firmware. But you have other dependencies, obviously.
You do, yeah, and I mean the big one there is going to be your electrical integration. So that does happen pretty early, and I will say, over the past few years, it's gotten faster. So we still work within 2-week sprints for firmware, and again, that's sort of something that gets sped up as you do more low power Bluetooth devices, right? Is the more devices you do, the faster you get, because you see sort of the patterns that emerge, and you're able to kind of leverage them and leverage past experience to sort of those previous roadblocks where for example, you come up, there's a cybersecurity requirement because you've involved your cybersecurity team early and often, where you have to retool a bit of the firmware, right? So you don't run into those as you have experience as often, because you've had sort of those scars, quite literally. But yeah, we still work within 2-week sprints, and from the opposite side, generally, Jim is absolutely correct. The software side, the app side, moves a little bit faster than the firmware side. So whereas the software side maybe has to use like sort of maybe a simulator sometimes or work on other stuff, the firmware is kind of, you'll have the app oftentimes to work with the device, and you'll have your sort of outside tools that allow you to interface with the device independent of the phone.
Could you guys dive in a little bit to the whole topic of simulators? Because it seems like it comes up a lot, and there's a lot of it in itself, and there's a lot of best practices around it. Because when you start developing Bluetooth, the other side isn't ready yet. So you need something to talk to that will pretend to be the other side. How does that work, starting from sort of your specification, test-driven design, integration to projects, et cetera?
Coming to an agreement on the profile itself is the first step. But once you have a profile identified and you have agreed on the hardware side and on the software side to what that profile looks like, what the data itself looks like that's going to be transmitted over that profile, you can put together a mobile-based application or a PC or Windows Mac-based application that provides that functionality as a peripheral device, which you can then develop against.
So you're just sort of like, it's like a test harness. You're putting some sets of dummy data in. It's not a fully operational device, right?
Correct, correct.
And
It-
how,
I will say one thing about that as well is so it sometimes, you know, you are going to need to test sort of things at scale, at volume, trying to go through a whole bunch of scenarios very quickly, right? Whereas an actual device is you know, going to get data from a sensor and going to actually do actual things. You can only run through those things as quickly as the device goes through them, right? So sometimes you want to say, I want to check all of these edge cases, all of these scenarios that have more to do with what's happening on the smartphone side, how it responds to those things. And if you don't want to spend a day running those tests, you want to run, you know, hundreds of these things within, you know, 15 minutes. That's where you automate it and you potentially have the emulator to go against rather than an actual device, right? For testing what happens, how the smartphone handles all those edge cases.
Yeah, and I would add to that, sometimes there are edge cases that are difficult to produce on the device itself, that an emulator can provide an alternative way of testing.
It's also kind of nice if you start thinking about this when you're designing it and you're building these simulators, because you're basically designing your verification validation tests at the same time. So it almost becomes free because you've got to do it anyway. So if you do it wisely and intelligently, you can also include security in those. You know, you can have test cases that say, what if I try to pair with it 10,000 times and does the device freeze up? You can actually have that as a test case. It's in your test suite because now you've got a way to simulate that. Whereas, you know, doing that, some of these tests you'll have to do against real hardware. Some of them you can stress test with an emulator or a simulator. It's really nice to have more control over one side of a link, but it's also important to test things talking to each other directly.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Kyle,
Conversely, I would add that having a test harness to perform that same functionality against the hardware is an advantageous change to investment as well.
so Kyle, from your side, are you using the same code? Are you guys sharing a code base, or those you each have a separate app doing separate simulations and, you know, writing their own logic?
Yeah, they're typically, you know, separate. But we do give, you know, complete that's another thing to kind of hit on too, especially when you have somebody like Jim on your team who has experience in the firmware side as well. You know, he's perfectly fluent in both sides, and that's rare to have, and we're lucky to have that. But where I'm going with that is giving Orthogonal access to our repo as well, so you can access, you know, again, shortening that feedback cycle. So having access to updated firmware images as they become available. You can work in some sort of continuous integration type things too, where, you know, the app is picking those up very quickly, and so on. So yeah, they're typically separate, but they're still very tightly linked just by nature of everybody kind of having access to it.
Got it. And is there anything different in terms of your side of simulators? Is it different than sort of a simulator for the smartphone app?
A little bit, yeah.
Mhm.
So the simulation for Bluetooth in particular is kind of hard. And we haven't, you know, that's something that we're still kind of digging into very heavily, because that would improve, you know, the feedback cycle again, common theme. But where we see a lot of sort of tools and utilities are in like a manufacturing or a test utility, right? Where you don't necessarily have to use the app, although exercising your customer or user facing interface is always advantageous, meaning use the app whenever you can. Use the update mechanism provided in the app nearly exclusively if you can. But at the same time, you can still create test utilities to exercise those things where you're not as governed by the walled garden sometimes that is the phone operating system, meaning you can kind of look a little bit outside and have a little bit faster control just by nature of it, not necessarily being a tool you're going to release, right? It's just a one-off thing that you're going to test with. But when, during development, it can be advantageous while you're, laser focused on a certain aspect to sort of tune that app or that utility really quickly without needing to kind of go through the release process and things like that. So again, shortening the feedback cycle as much as possible.
So building on one of your questions, then, it sounds like you can get some of the stuff from the wireless manufacturers. You can, one question to throw in is, does it have to be the same manufacturer as your chip? Second one is, are you just rolling your own code on each device and then you start over for the next project? Is there sort of a code library that builds over time in devices, or are there open source or commercial tools you can use, for some of that stuff? Where do you get your tooling?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a bit of both. So this is a question that sort of is near and dear to me. Experience matters here. So there's at least a few Bluetooth chip manufacturers that do a very good job. They have excellent SDKs. They have a ton of support. They have a wealth of examples that you can draw from, and so on, right? But you're still going to eventually start leaning towards one or the other. And just because you get used to, how that microcontroller works, there's little quirks for all of them, right? And there's different preferences for development environment and things like that too. So yeah, when you start a new project, it's not really a greenfield project more often than not. There's some exceptions there if you're in some very tight little niche, right? If you're extremely low cost, extremely small size, things like that, you may have to reach out of your normal toolbox. But what we found is those situations are sort of few and far between, because you can still stay generally within a manufacturer's garden, so to speak. But yes, when you're developing those tools, when you're developing new projects, you end up reaching for the same microcontroller families that you're used to, that you're comfortable with, that you have established resources that you can contact and get quick feedback loops from. But yeah, leveraging your previous experience is vitally important.
Jim, Buddy, Bernhard, any additional comments on the tooling subject? Or we move on?
It's equally true on the application side as well. Absolutely. There are certain considerations depending upon the application itself. In some cases, we might be using only an iOS type device for a given application where it's a dedicated type of application. In other cases, when we have to design for user provided iOS and or Android devices, that tends to drive the selection of technology as well. But typically we try to make use of any libraries that we accumulate over time as much as possible.
So actually wanted to ask my colleagues at Orthogonal, do you guys typically use something like a hybrid framework for the applications that you develop, or do you recommend native code on iOS and Android? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you approach that cross-platform compatibility with your clients.
It really depends to a great extent on the application itself. Certain applications require more intricate control of the Bluetooth device than other applications do. There might be a significantly higher throughput type of scenario, or a scenario where quick response to control the device itself is required. In those scenarios, we tend to stick with a native development environment. Alternately, if that is not a requirement and we are supporting both iOS and Android, we will go with hybrid solutions as well.
Yeah, and this hybrid solutions, I will say, have certainly matured. So both React Native and Flutter are pretty mature solutions, and Flutter in particular has native performance. The one thing I would say is, the cost calculation is not use a hybrid system, or a cross-platform system, therefore you have half the cost of doing two separate development efforts. Typically, we're talking about saving maybe 50%, maybe in the extreme case 75% on the second platform, depending on how simple it is or how much you have kind of native complexities that you have to deal with, like Bluetooth, but other things as well. I think the other thing we look at here is we'll also look at sort of what is the patient risk, where is this, how much of it is in the smartphone app, and that'll also drive things as well. So if we're an accessory to a class 3 device where we are controlling the class 3 device, and we have software safety classification class C functionality in the mobile app, we're going to say we're going to do this native. But if it's something much lower risk, then cross-platform is very viable. So we do a mix. I'd say we do, about half of our projects end up being pure native and the other half are cross-platform.
So there's a question from the audience which perfectly piggybacks on this and extends it. Compatibility. iOS and Android have different BLE stacks, especially on Android. Different manufacturers have their own implementation, or with OS upgrades, it could change. How do you manage for this? How do you solve for this issue in a mobile medical app? And how do you adapt to that heterogeneity?
A lot of testing, staying ahead of the game when new updates come out for phones. We have used gray list concepts in the past, and that has worked out well for us, whereby we will qualify which platforms do work with the device and which platforms have been proven to have problems, which platforms have not even been tested yet. And I think, Bernhard, you could probably talk to this as well. The fact that we do build into the application in scenarios like that some type of testability, whereby we can build out and collect data to populate and inform these gray lists that we set up for that purpose.
Yeah, I think there's the sort of, again, allow list, block list, gray list kind of thing, and then determining what you are allowing, based on what list you are on, right? And so, a new OS update, patch, etc., right? This is something that what is your determination? Have we tested this in the lab? Have we not tested this in the lab? What are we allowing and not allowing? The other thing you can do then is have sort of the concept of kind of a essential functions test, where you're doing field level self-validation at startup as part of that process, right? Same concept, I think, also when, let's say, you have jailbroken phones, right? Or some security issue, what you have to decide ahead of time. What are you just saying, okay, you can't use the app at all? Or are you allowing certain limited functionality? Those are all the kinds of decisions you have to make ahead of time when you have change, right? That's the key here. Some of the changes are things you can anticipate. A new operating system full release, you're going to have beta of this well ahead of time, and you can be testing on all of these things. But a security patch, you may not have that type of thing. Or a new phone release, hopefully you have some of that, but those are the techniques we end up using. Lots of testing, lots of test automation, testing on edge cases, etc., that you're doing, and then again leveraging that field level self-validation when you can. That just to add to that, that field level self-validation is not something that you can really is easy to bolt on at the end. That's also something that at design time, when you're thinking about this, are we going to do this because you need the firmware and the smartphone software to enable that field level self-validation. That's got to get built into the process. You don't bolt it on at the end. So again, talk about it early.
I think this also kind of depends on if you have a solution where the end user brings their own phone, which is a much more chaotic environment, but way more accessible. But you may have a situation where you as an MDM are providing a device that's locked down. And so in that case, you get to decide when those updates are going to get pushed down to that device, and you have your usability factors, but you don't necessarily have to worry about supporting, an ancient version of Android or iOS, or, you don't have to worry as much about a device compromise. But again, that's a trade-off, because now you're not just selling a device, you're also selling, say, an Android phone plus a device, and that introduces other complexities.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
But I will say this, in general, sort of supporting versions of Android or iOS that go back pretty far is definitely a security issue, because those aren't always updated and maintained. And, one of the things you can do on the smartphone side is you can force upgrade, right? You can say, sorry, you have to upgrade your operating system, otherwise you can no longer continue to use this application on this phone. And that's typically what we end up, doing as part of this, right? There's the bad typically outweighs the good in supporting, a 5-year-old phone that Apple is no longer supporting, or Samsung or whoever, right?
Kyle, how does that play out on the hardware, side if new versions of Bluetooth show up? Can you push off the smartphone, or does this actually trickle down into like a change in the device?
Sometimes it really, really depends. I'm going to say most of the time, right, if there's a new version of Bluetooth that comes out that adds some sort of large major capability, that's gonna only be released in a new chip. But there's, I do have some other examples where, chips have sort of added, especially security capability is going to be where you see this a lot, is in, the encryption side, connection side, bonding, pairing, things like that. That's going to kind of play into having a secure and well-tested firmware over-the-air update mechanism that allows you to update the stack as well. And that's a little bit device specific, especially for very resource constrained devices. Sometimes that update mechanism doesn't include the Bluetooth stack, and you would then need to sort of deal with that in your risk management, right? What are we going to do if there's a vulnerability found in the stack itself and we can't update, right? So that is a problem, and generally one that's fairly a little difficult to work around. But the best way to mitigate it would be to in the best case scenario, allow for your update mechanisms to also hit that Bluetooth stack.
Yeah, over-the-air update is definitely something that the FDA is requiring at this point for devices. You may be able to get through with a device that's not rechargeable, that has a lifetime of 2 weeks without having firmware update. But even that's going to be pretty difficult, and you're going to have to work pretty closely with the regulatory team to get that past FDA. But generally, you want to have over-the-air updates for all parts of the device, and that's really important right now.
Are you seeing the FDA also require that for the Bluetooth stack? To Kyle's point.
I'm thinking more of the firmware in general, which would include the Bluetooth stack on the device. I don't think they're going to be as stringent on the mobile app or the mobile operating system updates, because you don't necessarily control that. but they definitely want you to be able to update the device and recover if there's a failed update. And again, as you said earlier, this kind of depends on the safety risk of the device.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the general cybersecurity is driving the vast majority of that, right? And the FDA, as and we know in our conversations with folks at the FDA, is one of their major points of emphasis, and has been over the last an increasing point of emphasis over the last 3 to 5 years. So.
Interesting question from the audience. Someone asked if you ever have to use an oscilloscope to see what's going on because you have timing constraints or tricky problems.
Yeah, I think that's the question for me. Yeah, absolutely. So especially when you're dealing with sort of analog signals, you would perhaps reach for the oscilloscope. More often I see a little bit more logic analyzer type things where, you're dealing with, external flash chips or sensors or things like that. From a Bluetooth itself perspective, I've never used sort of an oscilloscope or anything like that to kind of look at the Bluetooth antenna type, workflows. But generally, another big one for us is to recommend the use of sort of pre-certified, FCC pre-certified Bluetooth modules whenever possible, unless you're talking about, extreme quantities. Generally, it's fairly cost effective, so you don't have to go through that process yourself. And the other benefit of that is generally you get a well-designed antenna. So the opportunities where you would need to reach for an oscilloscope sort of gets confined down to your analog signals of interest, the base sensing methodology of the device itself. So what are you reading from the user, and what are you spitting out? So yeah, no, absolutely, an oscilloscope is an important tool in a hardware engineer's arsenal.
All right, another question here. Any EMC worries or considerations that play a role with dealing with the BLE, e.g. Nordic?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So EMC, ESD, both of those, again, mitigated very strongly by use of like a pre-certified module. I can't say I've had a ton of difficulty in the EMC world, especially for battery operated devices, that are typically, when you talk Bluetooth, you're typically talking pretty low power, and not very fast. So you're not getting, you're not really hammering high speed edges or things like that, that are going to resonate outside the board. So EMC typically passes sort of with flying colors on the first try. You do have to be a little careful with, your buck boost converters and things like that. But again, you can get away with using LDOs, and just having a mind towards EMC as you're designing the hardware itself. But again, definitely reaching for those pre-certified modules when you can, and following the manufacturer's recommended specs in the data sheet when you're doing layout, things like that.
And on the smartphone side, you're leveraging smartphones that have gone through all of this kind of testing as part of what you're doing. Now, that doesn't, if someone brings in a smartphone from outside of the US that's not gone through that here, I don't know what you're going to get. But again, that's where you have your allow list, block list, all those types of things as well.
Looks like we have one last question that came in. Bernhard, you mentioned something about edge cases. Could you talk a little bit about that? What those are, and how that plays into this question of coordination between two teams and technical handshakes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had another webinar 2 or 3 webinars ago, maybe 2 webinars ago, where we were talking about edge cases specifically, and I think there's an entire webinar as well as blog posts on those edge cases. So I think you have certain types of things that happen that are, let's just call them, not the happy path, right? So for whatever reason, your Bluetooth connection is interrupted, as an example, right? It could be that your smartphone died, right? Ran out of battery. Okay. And it was in the middle of doing something. How do you handle that, right? Or or it could be that you're in a house like mine. Your device is on one side of the house, and my house has really thick walls from the 1920s. Sometimes I'm not going to have really great Bluetooth connectivity in all places of the house, right? Or you put your smartphone in your backpack, and the device you have is an implanted device, right? So there are all kinds of things around just the fact that you're going to have things in the physical environment that you're going to be dealing with, but also things that could happen with one device, one side of it, or with the other side that you have to deal with. I mean, I think we have a library of edge cases that we have come across. Not all of them are purely Bluetooth related, right? There's other smartphone related edge cases that, let's say you are in a at one we call Niagara Falls, right, where you are literally between two different countries and two different carriers, and you could be switching back and forth between Rogers and AT&T and what have you, and maybe in some cases different time zones that you're dealing with. And for a CGM device or something, you have those time zones you have to deal with. Or Siberia, where in Russia you're not going to be able to sync your time clock between a world clock, your smartphone, and then syncing that, if you're doing that type of syncing, down to the device itself. So many of these are the types of things that you end up having to deal with, and come up with graceful solutions for it. Some of those are on the smartphone side, some are on the firmware side, and some are sort of jointly shared between those things.
Yeah, and another interesting point there to add on is that the amount of edge cases that you run into sometimes is mitigated by a good upfront design, where you're sitting down with the app development team and hammering this out, and especially when both sides sort of have these scars from these edge cases that you've had to tackle in the past. And when you start running into edge cases, the very best thing to do, and that we've mentioned on and hammered on throughout this webinar, is fast lines of feedback and communication. And in this case, a lot of times for those edge cases, the best way to hammer them through is to sit down with the app developers, the firmware developers, and the key stakeholders of the product itself, because a lot of times sometimes the solution is adjusting the user needs a little bit, or updating instructions for use, or things like that. So there's other ways other than pure app development or pure firmware to work around some of these, and sometimes it requires that, and sometimes it requires a compromise, because they're edge cases for a reason.
Yep. And then there's scenarios that you run across. So here's an example, right? We have a device that you can use without having the smartphone, right? So someone is going along and using this device, and data is accumulating on this device. And then 3 months later, it said, you know what? I'm going to try the smartphone app. Let me do this and connect this. And of course, one of the things the smartphone app is going to want to do is get that data and get it up into the cloud and populate things in the app based on that. If you have 3 months of data, you have to think about how much data is that, and what of that data do I really need, or what do I need first, right? So, most of the time you want to have a, foreground LIFO, last in, first out kind of thing, with the rest of the data coming, that you don't necessarily need, right away. Maybe you do in background processing over time to get there, right? That's an edge case that you have to think through at the beginning, because that's part of, you know, how you deal with large volumes of data, right? Or just background processing at the beginning, sort of just do the math. What am I trying to pull through on what kind of frequency? Is it, you know, waveform data that is, you know, with great frequency? That could be, you could have some constraints on how much you can pull through, right? Some point you're going to reach the edges of what you can do with Bluetooth, especially with background processing on the smartphone. Many cases you're not dealing with sort of those extremes, right, of throughput and needs around that. Not everything is pulling video from a device continuously or something like that, right?
Yeah, and another good point too with that you mentioned an edge case due to not needing necessarily to have a direct connection to the app, right? For 3 months, that in itself can be a mitigation for another edge case or a whole host of edge cases. It's like, you know, by making that decision, you can sidestep a lot of the questions around, well, what happens if the user loses their phone, doesn't have their phone, is in a football game and doesn't have good Bluetooth reception because there's 10,000 other devices around them. So by giving the device a little bit of autonomy, you can kind of sidestep that. So there's sort of edge cases on edge cases, and the decisions you make can sort of spiral through and hit other things also. And that's just one example of that. And that's kind of where it pays to have people that have gone through this process early and often.
For sure.
All right. Well, I think that's the end of the questions we have, and we've covered all of our topics. I want to thank our panelists today for just a wealth of knowledge. It's really, this was chock full of gold nuggets. I think a lot of people walked away with them. I've gotten some notes here, and I want to thank our attendees who hung in with us for this long. We don't take it for granted that you give us time at all, and we certainly don't take it for granted that you give us more than an hour. We know what your days are like because they're probably like ours. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us. And, you know, shameless plug, I guess, if you're looking for, you know, medical device smartphone app development, give us a call. If you're looking for medical device firmware hardware development, you can call Kyle. And if you've got cybersecurity questions or concerns, you can call Buddy. Thank you very much to everybody for this.
Best call all of us at once and we can work together because we love working together.
FaceTime.
Exactly.
Good.
Yeah.
FaceTime us all at once. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Bye.